Welcome to 2 Month Review, the weekly podcast in which we talk about a particular author's works, bit by bit, section by section, enjoying them, discussing them, appreciating the books, and showing what makes them interesting. This is, as always, Chad Post, and I'm joined by Brian Wood. And this week, our special guest is
Hello.
I never know when you're going to do it.
You cut me off again, man. What the heck?
Never certain. We'll never get this right. And this week, our special guest is Marife Letham, who's a freelance translator from Spanish and Catalan, and who has translated, according to our translation database, 15 different books. I don't know if that's right.
Possible.
Okay. Including Albert.
At least.
Yeah, this only goes back so far, so I think it's missing some stuff. But you've translated Javier Calvo's Wonderful World. Also, apropos of this, Albert Sanchez Piñol's Pandora in the Congo. More recently, Tony Sala's The Boys. Jaime Cabre's and other Catalan authors' Confessions. A ton of stuff. And actually, as a special announcement here, we actually got the rights to a book by Max Bezzora that's called, what is the full title of this? Oh man, where is it? Adventures and Misadventures of Juan Orpi. But it's a much longer title than that, and I don't have it all translated out here. But do you mind if I read your description of this book, since you're going to be translating it for us?
No, go right ahead.
Okay, so we had found out about this on our trip. Kai and I were in Spain and Barcelona for a trip through the Ramon Llull Institute, and we were able to find a lot of information about new Catalan authors. And we want to do this series of 5 books over a 5-year period of Catalan literature that doesn't include Rodoreda or Manzo, who we already published, but a mixture of contemporary stuff and modern stuff. And the first contemporary book that we found was from Max Bezzora, which is this whole long titled book, and it sounded brilliant and fantastic. So we asked you, Mara, to read it for us, and you sent back a little quote that I'll just read to everyone so you get a taste of what this is. Based on the real historical figure of Juan Orpi, who lived from 1593 to 1645, a conquistador who sought his fortune in the Americas and ended up founding New Catalonia, it is ostensibly written by an anonymous soldier during the 1714 siege of Barcelona and presented in a pseudo-critical edition. This acid trip of a novel of adventures is in dialogue with classic works such as Gulliver's Travels, Gargantua and Pantagruel, and Don Quixote, and offers a satirical vision of 17th century Catalonia and the Spanish Empire of the Golden Age with a distinctly postmodern tinge. All the meta aspects keep the style very fresh, and it's occasionally laugh out loud funny. I'm very excited that we're going to be able to work on that book too.
Me too. It's there's a lot of young talent in Catalonia right now that hasn't been tapped. So I'm glad you guys are taking notice.
Yeah, and the book sounds crazy. I think there's UFOs in it too, if I remember right.
It's there's some alien stuff. It's very scatological too, which is highly Catalan if you aren't aware of that.
Yeah, isn't there like a figure? There's something I remember. This is just coming back to me. Isn't there something that, like, speaking of scatological things, the guy that used to work at the New York Times who wrote about Brazil, what's his name? He wrote an article about us too. But he was telling me once at a cocktail party that there's some like big figure, like some pooping figure from Catalonia. Is this
We have a few very scatological Christmas traditions.
Yes.
The Catalan addition to the creche is a little, peasant figure traditionally who is taking a shit. He's got his pants down and he's crapping beside the whatever it is, the cradle and the the baby Jesus. I
heard that's the new White House China design they're doing because each president gets their own China, and I think the China for this president is just shit on a plate
that we all have to eat. So then that figure of the little peasant is reproduced with every modern, all the politicians and Donald Trump and, the football players and SpongeBob and the Smurfs, and everybody gets to, you turn it around and their pants are down and there's a little curl of a turd. that's not all. That's not all. That's just in the crash. But there's the kagatillo, which translates to the shit log, which is kind of what it sounds like: a log with a face and a pipe, usually, and little front legs that wears a hat, typical Catalan pet hat.
Oh my goodness!
But red. And you cover him with a blanket so he stays warm, and you feed him for weeks. As Christmas approaches,
it's like 8.
And so I there's probably not children listening to this, right?
No, probably not.
But so if you're the parent, you have to eat the things that you leave for the shit log, because the kids are looking in the morning. Did he eat it? Did he eat it? And so you always have to remember to eat it after the kids go to bed. And then when the day comes,
honey, did you remember to eat the shit log food? Oh, damn! All right, let me go eat the shit. Hold on, like this is crazy.
And then you take a stick and you beat the shit log till it poops out some presents. And there's a little
oh my god!
That basically says shit log shit. If you don't shit us some presents, which is usually food or tiny little gifts, but we're going to beat it even harder. So the kids all take turns beating the shit log, the tillo, with a stick. So it's special.
This is
special
so much
time.
better than Elf on the Shelf.
Yeah, the traditions in the Death in Spring aren't all that weird now.
No, this is just
Right?
a goddamn realistic
Give you a little
novel.
context. Wait till you read Max Bezora's book.
Dude, I cannot wait. That was the first book that when we found out about that during one of the first speeches from Jordi Nopka, it was like, whoa, this sounds right. He's like, I've looked at a lot of your catalogs, and I thought this book might seem appealing to some of you. And I was like, he is talking directly to us. This is 100% a crazy Pinchonian sort of scatological, crazy narrative, faux 17th century thing. Perfect, down the middle of the plate. But anyways, one other announcement before we get more into this is that, Brian, you have the big announcement that you signed on, your book is going to be published, your book of short stories, Walking Dogs, which congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. I completely tricked somebody into taking it. So, hooray! Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. Thanks.
So expect everyone.
I think it's not coming out for like a year and a half though, so it'll be a while. So.
Well, by that point, we'll have a much larger audience, and every one of them will buy every copy they can for all their friends.
Absolutely.
So Mari, we can talk about Rotorua, but also we've talked a bit about the situation in Catalunya and the referendum on here. But it was at the beginning of when we started doing this season, which was weeks ago now. And it was shortly after coming back from Spain. So everything was sort of at that moment in time. What's going on now, and what's your overall take on this? If you wanna fill us in.
Oh, it's very complex, and I don't claim to be an expert. But it's one of the things I wanted to ask you about in this book, because I know you published this in 2009.
Yep.
Is that?
That's
okay.
Correct.
Because in Catalunya, a new edition of this has just come out about a month ago, and it's on the bestseller list. Are you aware of this?
No, yeah. I was not. That's amazing.
So I don't know if you've met Maria Boigas. She is an editor and actually also the granddaughter of Joan Salas.
Yes, I did.
And she's kind of revived his publishing house, which is called Club Editor, and has been bringing things back out. And they did a revised edition. So I want to ask you about your edition, too, because it's actually a somewhat different edition that they spent 10 years kind of reconstructing based on manuscripts and different versions of this book. Because I don't know if you probably discussed this on prior podcasts, but this book was technically unfinished at the time of her death. And so there's a few versions, and if I'm not mistaken, this translation is from the 2008 version.
Correct. That's yes, yeah, that's accurate.
And so this newer one actually goes back to a previous version that was created by Joan Salas's widow, Núria Folch, and modified now by another scholar named Arnaud Pons, based on manuscripts of the novel and the correspondence between Joan Salas and Mercè Rodoreda, which has also recently been published by Club Editor. So there's a whole interesting story. But to me, it's fascinating that this book is a bestseller in Catalonia right now. And
obviously a bestseller here, too.
Well, I actually had read, I don't know if this is true, that this book is one of the bestsellers of Open Letter. Is that true?
It is absolutely. It's I haven't finished our most recent sales report, but it's always number 1 or number 2.
Wow.
And has been for forever. Because I don't know which edition you have of ours too, because it was one of our first books. We used to do paper over board, so hardcover copies. And this is the first book that completely sold out of the hardcover. We reprinted the hardcover, and then we did the paperback edition, and we've done the paperback edition twice. So it's our most successful book. And it's partially because it just keeps getting rediscovered at some points in time. Like Jesmyn Ward, who's on all of the best year-end best of book lists right now, she did a whole piece on it for NPR back in like 2011, 2012, and that relaunched everything for it. And then it just kind of keeps steadily selling for us. So it's one of our best books.
So yeah, it's a book with a really fascinating publication history, and this kind of relaunch, if you will, that has just been done by Club Editor is with also a new translation into Spanish that simultaneously published. And so I've been reading some things around that written by the scholar who worked on this edition, and the translator into Spanish, who's been very involved with the promotion of this new edition. But, Catalans are living in a world where yellow has been outlawed, the color yellow, and it could be straight out of this book.
Right. Why is yellow outlawed?
Well, the pink ribbon for breast cancer, the yellow ribbon in Catalonia is for freedom for the political prisoners. There are 10 people, mostly politicians, but also, or activists, organizers in civil society, who have been held in prison now for, the first few were imprisoned before the October 1st elections. And then there's been this sort of, like a soft takeover of Catalonia by the Spanish state, where they set in motion this article that is unprecedented to be actually used in the Spanish Constitution, which allows them to just take over all the Catalan political institutions and control the finances, and they've set elections for the 21st of this month. Meanwhile, the president, who they've fired, they kind of dismissed the entire government, is in exile in Brussels, and it's quite a surreal situation in the 21st century. It's also, you're not allowed to use the term political prisoners on television at this point. So there's it's a real human rights disaster that's basically being pretty ignored by Europe, because obviously Catalan independence would be very problematic for the EU, and is not something that they want to encourage. However, this is set in motion a situation where the human rights violations are being considered. Well, it's an internal affair of Spain, and we don't really want to mess with it. And it's you sort of need a legal degree to understand the news each day of different interpretations of things, and if you watch the Catalan news and then you watch the Spanish news and you see how it's being covered in The Guardian is one of the main English language outlets that are doing a pretty good job of covering it. But then there's independentist Scottish papers you can read, and what is the truth is somewhat elusive because there's so much feeling around it, so much emotion, and it's very complex. But the actual reality of just sort of being politically invaded, and having this oppression just put in place legally is very relevant to this novel.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting that it's. It's also being sold as a rediscovery of Rodorreda's work. I don't know if listeners know this, but she's someone who's, you're forced to read her in high school. And so some of her most famous novels are considered sort of, traumatic school reading experiences that this novel is then sort of presented as an antidote to, if you will.
Wow.
So
this section in particular.
At all.
Yeah, no. That's really helpful. The only other follow-up I'd have is what do you hope happens? I don't know. I mean, the situation feels almost unresolvable at this moment in time, and it seems like even when you look at it from like as far distant as you can, like it doesn't seem like a easy solution as like, well, this is what should happen to Catalonia or to Spain as a whole. But it's what's your feeling?
Oh, it's something that's evolved over time, and it's interesting because when I think about it, there's a lot of fear involved, and of course, fear is very important in this novel.
Oh yeah,
fear versus desire, and there's moments when I felt very excited about the possibility of what Catalonia could achieve as a smaller society, and other times when I felt afraid of the sacrifices that seem to be involved, and the sort of neoliberal structures that make it seem impossible. Besides the lack of dialogue, which is very problematic, and a lot of the lack of nuance in the discussions, because there are Catalans who are not fascists who don't want Catalonia to be an independent state, and that's something that needs to be addressed, I think, better by Catalan society, because the independentist movement has a lot of very beautiful things about it. I don't know what you were able to see while you were there, but as a pacifist, for me, it's very inspiring and lovely to see how you could almost hear a pin drop in some of these demonstrations.
Yeah.
We've really been forced to be above reproach in terms of violence, and I don't know of any revolution that's been achieved without violence.
Yeah.
So
That really gels with what I saw. We were there for the 9/11 parade or like demonstration that they had with I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people, but where they created the check mark or no the X, and it was completely peaceful and like very civilized and not disruptive in any sort of violent way at all. So that seems a match.
More than a million.
More than a million. Jesus. It was gigantic. They put us in a hotel right in the center of that too. So it was we were surrounded.
Well, the Catalan National Day is the celebration of a defeat.
Yeah, which is interesting.
And that goes back to Max Bezora's novel, because it's set the telling of it is set in that moment, that historical moment in 1714.
Oh yeah, that makes sense too.
That's celebrated on the September 11th. But I have sometimes hope for a better plan for the future than has been presented. There's a lot of emotion, and I mean, there's a lot of things. I'm of course a Republican, not in the American sense of the word, but in the Spanish. And so the idea of leaving behind, the problems of the Spanish state and the Spanish monarchy is, of course, very appealing. At the same time, I remember I was actually in New York when the Scots were voting, and I realized we had a referendum in Catalonia prior to that was sort of unofficial.
Yep.
And I had voted yes without much hesitation, because we were partly voting for the right to vote, which of course is pretty hard not to get behind. What in Catalan is called the right to decide, the self-determination of the Catalan people, and so I had voted for it, and then I guess it was a year later. I think it was 2014 when the Scots voted, and they had a very, very, very different experience of voting, because there was sort of this Better Together campaign that the UK did, which it sounds like an Al Green song or something. And it was like they were being wooed to stay, and which is something that the Catalans never get. There's and much worse, which has been kind of an ugly side of this whole process, as well as to see, and some of it is fascism that's dormant or not so dormant, as we see in many societies, but a real anger and violence towards the very idea of Catalan self-determination. That when the Scots were voting, I thought, oh God, I realized in my heart of hearts that I was hoping they were going to vote no, because if they voted yes, we were right behind them, and I didn't feel ready, and I felt nervous, and maybe that's I'm not a good revolutionary. I don't know, but I had to be honest with myself in that moment, and think about what sacrifices were entailed in this, and so that was a moment of reckoning for me.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
I haven't quite figured out. I'm not going to be in Catalonia on the 21st, so I'm not going to vote.
But you will be beating your shit log.
Yes. I may be one of the very few Americans who does have a shit log. My father made me one. They're not that hard to make, actually.
Oh man, I'm going to introduce this to my children, and they are going to love every bit about Catalonia and Spain. So, but anyway, should we talk a bit about the section of the book too? get into it. I usually try and summarize what happens in the particular section that we're going to go over. So I'll give this one a shot too, and then we can just talk about the sections that you guys found most interesting. But it starts about 5 years after the end of part 2, in which his child, he and his stepmother have had a child. She is now 4. It is she is 4. And she hangs out a lot with the blacksmith's son. Meanwhile, our narrator kind of goes through the town, ends up doing certain things with the blacksmith's son, including tormenting a guy whose main job is to live in a cage and evade people who try and beat him with a cudgel until they get exhausted, and then they find wisdom, which is something we could maybe talk about. And then the blacksmith sends the narrator to talk to Signor because he has to deliver him a message. And Signor tells, in this long sort of moving section, tells the narrator about how he doesn't want to die the way that everyone is meant to die in this village, where they get their mouths filled with cement so that their souls can't escape. And so then he comes back down with all this sort of knowledge of the Signor is almost going to pass away. He's old, he's decrepit, and he's terrified of having the cement in his mouth. And of course, then the villagers do it anyways, and the blacksmith's totally pissed about it and is like, no, he needs to have it done the way everyone does. It's dangerous. So they fill the Signor's mouth with cement. He dies, and then all hell breaks loose, and including there's fires, and the narrator's daughter is killed, is stoned to death, and the section ends with him burying her not in a tree, which is usually the way that everyone's been buried, but outside of that, in the ground. And one of the most disturbing passages for like anyone who has kids or is about to have a kid. This is not the best section to read at this point in time. But yeah, so that's how it sort of ends. I guess that's an okay summary.
Yeah, there's a lot of action in this section.
I thought it was interesting too that last section we had a lot to do with the stepmother. It was him and the stepmother going around causing chaos, uprooting the taking the bones out of the trees, all that kind of stuff. And this time she's almost not in here at all. It's mostly the blacksmith's son and a little bits with his daughter, but even that is kind of removed. So he sort of went into a different direction than was left at end of part 2.
Yeah, that was something that really surprised me, because the previous section, there's so much description and feelings of him and his wife, or what's going to become his wife. And in this one, there's very little talk about the daughter. Like she's there, but she's almost not there in the way he describes things. It's really interesting.
Well, there's a interesting kind of autobiographical reading of this, which I don't know how much you guys are familiar with, but Merced Rodoreda was forced to marry her uncle quite young for basically family financial reasons, it seems. And it had a child, which, I mean, I don't want to presume, but it seems that she didn't want to have. And there seems to be a parallel here with the child who, there are different parts where he says, well, I never loved her, or things like that. And so when she went into exile while she kind of lost everything, she lost Catalonia and the life she had known, she also experienced a liberation. She was able to, because of the Republic, she was able to separate from her husband. And then when she went to France, she fell in love and started this new life with a Catalan intellectual who was also part of the group in exile there. And so I see this part as being very interesting in terms of the maternal feelings or lack thereof.
Yeah, I underlined this part in 114 when he's reflecting on his child. He's going to bury her. When she was born, I had not loved her. She looked peculiar when my wife showed me to her. It was as if a nuisance had settled into the house. I wanted to run away so I would not have to see the thing that clearly I had made, because life is sad. To be born is sad.
Fuck this section, man.
Happy.
It's so depressing.
Yeah.
Like the two great fears that anxieties that I have in life, aside from work related, are a fear of death and a fear of like children dying. And this is like just banging away at those things in like the most specifically neurosis making ways. Like to be,
yeah,
like,
you're not going to find that in a Hallmark card that you give to somebody. Hey, congratulations on your baby girl. I got a little Rotorita quote for you inside the card. Here.
There's one more section that this is a bit longer. This is the one that I had highlighted as like my ultimate favorite part of this section, or one of them is right after that when he says, when she cried, I was the one who wished to cry loudly. I would have preferred her not to be born because I knew it awaited her. Breathing. Only the chore and sadness of breathing and breathing as things change from tender to dry, new to old, the night moon that grows thin then swells, the fireless sun that lights up, the soughing of wind that transports, shatters, gathers, and drives away the clouds, raising and flattening the dust. Only the sorrow of going to sleep and waking up, feeling life without knowing where it comes from, aware that it will flee without knowing why it was given to you, why it was taken from you. Here you are, there's this and this and this, and now enough. Yeah. Her books aren't. This book is not necessarily a happy one.
This book is also. I mean, when I started to read it, I was very surprised at the language, at the allegorical nature of it, the philosophical, the lack of realism.
Yeah.
It's quite unique in her work. Although one could, and some have, say that, you know, there's a lot of sprouts and nuggets of her other works in this. And this was something that she actually was writing. She started writing in the 60s and worked on it was right after La Plaza del Diamant, which in the U.S. is mostly known as In the Time of the Doves, in David Rosenthal's translation, and more recently published in the UK. I don't know if it's come out here as in Peter Bush's translation, called Diamond Square. And which is her most famous book, and was a big success in Catalonia at the time, and made her a celebrated author. Yet this book wasn't published until after her death, and she came back to it many times. She didn't die for 23 more years. She died in 83, I believe. And she struggled with this book. She came back to it and reworked it. So, and even when she died, it wasn't finished completely. So that's what has led to sort of the different versions and the sort of possibly controversial reconstructions based on manuscripts.
Right. My sense of it was that it was like she had the complete vision of it, but she was still constantly like reworking sections or sort of redoing it. So it was like finished but not complete, or I don't know which way you want to say that, or complete but not finished, or whatever. Like it wasn't. She wasn't ever going to write another part to it, right? It was just this story just being sort of like rejiggered at times.
Well, I'm not the best person to ask, but I think that there are even two endings, and there was sort of a postscript, and there's and the four sections as we have them here were reworked at different times.
Yeah.
So that there was one version, which I think is this one that you've translated, that was presented to an award jury to try and win a prize.
Right.
And then there were later versions. So this is kind of a reboot of a sort of a scholarly edition that was done by Nuria Folk when it was first published in 1986.
Yeah.
So but it's interesting to look at it as sort of that. In some ways, it reads as very anomalous. On the other hand, it could also sort of be this latent sort of coda that explains a lot of her work, which is much more real. It's a kind of, there's these novels of manners, basically. So for people familiar with her best known works, this is kind of a shocking novel in its form and style.
Although it sort of relates, I think, like for me, I haven't read. There's a few that haven't been translated. One of which we're going to be doing in like 2019 or something. The Garden by the Sea. So there's a couple things that are still out there, but of the ones that have been translated, I've read basically everything. And the thing the way that I would group it is that these later ones, like A Broken Mirror and War So Much War and Death in Spring, sort of seem of a type of her writing. That after Time of the Doves and a lot of the stories that we went through up to like the last ones with like Salamander, which is a little bit more surreal, and a few of the war ones, these other three novels all seem to be a little bit more moving in this direction, especially like A Broken Mirror that goes from being very much like the novel of manners and about a family saga into like something that's much more fragmented and little aphorisms and like very strange at the end. And then War So Much War has like sort of teeters between those two. But yeah, it is. I know that most people have read Time of the Doves, and anyone that I've talked to that has read that then will come to this and be like, who the fuck? Like, this is not the same author. Yeah. It doesn't even seem to relate. But yeah, there is still something of like her precision that's in those early things is here, but in a world that is so much different. And it's almost in a sense like stripped bare, like all those like niceties of life that exist when you're reading Time of the Doves, that you sort of understand what that world is and you can fill in the sort of surrounding bits to it. That's gone here. Now we have like these descriptions of the ivy and the seigneur's house and the dust and the river. Then that's all we have because it doesn't seem to fit like a real world. So it brings out the poetry in it, I think.
There, I wrote down here a quote that's from Maria Boigas, the editor of this new version, and she said, "There's a political Rodoreda who's been hidden under a ton of flowers." That I think is interesting. It really highlights her.
That is a great quote. I love that.
Desire to like shift the canonical view of how this author is read and open the door to new audiences. I was kind of curious how you came to publish this book, since I've been reading so many things about this new edition, and so I've been so kind of fascinated by its reception.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward publishing story in a way. I went on a trip to Barcelona through the Ramon Llull Institute back in like the end of 2006 or like in the fall of 2006. And it was weird because it was like I went to Iceland and then Barcelona all on the same trip because they were paired together. So it was kind of a strange sequence of temperatures. But when I was there, it was the first time that I'd really become aware of like what Catalan literature was. Like I'd heard a couple names vaguely, but like it was like a whole new world. And the people from the Ramon Llull, Misia and Sonia were there at that time. Misia still is. They were incredibly helpful in like introducing me to editors, bringing me to places, and giving me just general introductions. And this was right before they became the guest of honor at Frankfurt. Like I think that was in 2008, maybe 2007 or 2008. So I met with a bunch of people, and Rodoreda kept coming up over and over and over again, and specifically A Broken Mirror. And she did, and Kim Manzo. And they had certain things that had been translated and things that they were working on getting samples of because of the Frankfurt Book Fair big presentation. So when I got back, it was right as Open Letter was being founded, and I went and read all of her books that I could find, because they didn't think anything. They knew Time of the Doves had been translated, but they didn't think Broken Mirror had. But it had just come out from the University of Nebraska, so I read that first and was like, "Holy shit, this is right down the middle of the plate for me." So I started looking into it, and when we found which books weren't translated, we immediately jumped on Death in Spring because it sounded like one that was more in keeping with Broken Mirror, and it seemed like a book that would be like a real good statement book for Open Letter is like one of our first titles to be like, this is what we're going to do as a publishing house and as an editorial vision. And then when we talked to Martha Tennant, and she gave us like the sample, and you read like any part of this, like you could read any paragraph of this and be like, yes, this is absolutely the sort of book that we want to be publishing. And then that all worked out from there, and we ended up doing this, and then at that time, Martha recommended doing the stories, so we did that next. And then there was this is an interesting side note for anyone in publishing history. So on her agent's website, it had claimed that War So Much War had been published in Tri-Quarterly magazine. Like the full translation had been published there in like 1988 or something like that, or 92. And so I went through our library here at the university because I was like, I want to read more of her, and this is the only other thing that I haven't read. And so I went through all the magazines, and it didn't exist. It had never been published. So like they had, I guess, signed a contract or planned on it, but it just never happened. So we were able then to be like, well, can we do that book next? And basically like almost sight unseen, we're like, yes, we'll do it. And the same thing is going on now where we're doing Camilla Street and Garden by the Sea, because we're just anything that we can do. And one other like publishing note for people listening and interested in this, and you're talking about the bestseller list, is that Penguin UK is bringing out a new edition of Death in Spring, which hasn't been available there except in our edition for years, for over a decade. It never had been. It had only been available in our edition, and no one else has ever published it there. So Penguin UK is going to do their first version as like sort of a rediscovered classic. So there's a chance, if all the publishing gods align, that this could become a really big deal over there and resurface over here again. And have all these podcasts there sitting, waiting for like readers to listen to as soon as they find out about her.
So are they going to, I mean, first of all, it sounds like a David Rosenthal thing, that previous version that didn't actually exist of War So Much War.
I bet you're right.
That probably his death. Was he the translator?
It didn't. There was no reference. The only reference that existed was just the publication date and the location, like where the rights were sold. So, like, when you look at like an author's or an agent's website, it'll say like Death in Spring, Open Letter Books, 2009. And it was just that. It was just like Tri-Quarterly, like 1993 or whatever it was. And so that's why I just started hunting it down. But you're probably right that he was going to do it. And didn't he pass away near that point in time too?
Yeah, in the 80s. I'm not sure exactly when. But he, for those who don't know, we should give him his props. David Rosenthal was an American Catalanophile who really did an amazing job of bringing a lot of important Catalan works into English, both as the translator, but also promoting them and doing it just a lot of legwork at a time when no one else was doing it. And while I don't like the title In the Time of the Doves, he really needs to be acknowledged for what he did. And then, some of that work was cut short by his death, too young. But he was did a quite good job of choosing things to promote, and was quite successful in getting things to an English speaking audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I always liked I thought his translation was perfectly fine. The title aside, the title is weird, but like that seems like as much of a marketing decision as anything else.
Well, you never know with titles because, of course, the publishing houses have so much to say about them, and we
change them all the time. Yes.
So yeah. But I was recently in London at a conference that was the most specific conference I've ever been to. And it was about Catalan works of literature, including poetry, prose, and theater in English translation. And I realized that La Plaza del Diamant is the only Catalan book that's been published in 3 different English translations. So it has a special while scholars of course are very focused on comparing those translations. The first of which was done by an Irish woman.
That one I don't know.
I'm not sure what the title was, but she gave it an Irish slant.
Oh, geez.
Peter Bush has an interesting article about this. I'll send it to you if you want.
Okay.
But one of the other things that I was looking at around this new publication in Catalonia is that there's also a critical edition of the correspondence between Joan Salas, author of Uncertain Glory, but also the Mercè Rodoreda editor in Catalan. And so their correspondence has recently been published. So there's a few moments where she's talking about death in spring. And I want to read you just a couple quotes. The first one is, "Death in spring is very good, terribly poetic and terribly black. In my current style, first person and attempting to say things in the purest and most unexpected way. It will be a novel of love and infinite loneliness."
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah.
And it is.
And then this is the next one. "I wanted to show the excruciatingly slow spasms of a bud sprouting from a branch, the violence with which a plant expels a seed."
Wow. This is one of those chapters, too, where a lot of that sort of like the violence and the like sort of the nature takes on like weird sort of violent tones, and everything like the spring is not good in the way that like you usually think of like spring as rebirth or something like that. Like Signor refers to that a few times as being, and it doesn't seem positive in his light. So this is one where like that sort of like growth of like nature being both violent and beautiful seems to come into play.
Yeah, I'd love to read a little bit about that on page 98, where she says, "Spring is sad. In spring, all the world is ill. Plants and flowers are earth's plague, rotten. The earth would be calmer if it were greenless, without this fury, this blind will that consumes everything but craves more. The affliction of the green, so much greenness and poisonous color. When the wind drives everything from one end of the world to the other, seeds and particles and everything it covets, then men become tormented. Birds contribute to this, so do bees. They carry so much sulfur dust caught on their backs, their legs. Nothing carries as much sulfur dust as bees. The man in the cage used to say, 'Kill the wisteria.' He said it often. I know they spread honey on him. He'd often say that. He was truly a man. Now they say he's thin as a cane, his brain twisted round."
And
"One morning, you'll get up thinking that the things you carry within you have died, but it won't be true. When you think this has happened, it'll really be you who has died a bit. Things don't die; they continue." I mean, and it's this this idea of spring as carnal desire, obviously, but sort of this flip side of the rebirth of spring and how it's usually thought of in the Judeo-Christian ideology. It's this rotten, moldy, growing, never stopping growing, and how these oppressive organisms try to keep it down.
Yeah. Man, this is a great section. Very interesting. I mean, the whole book is fantastic. This section really, I think, is very, very pointed, and it includes like some of the new sort of traditions that we learn about, but also like shows what happens when they try and go against one of them by not wanting to get the cement in their mouth, and like how that leads to this pure chaos. I think this is really like an important and interesting part of this book for everyone who's still reading along. But we should probably start wrapping up. Brian, did you have a favorite line that you wanted to share?
Good Lord, there was so many, but I think just the very, very last image of part 3, I enjoyed quite a bit. Craft-wise, I really like it when something is completely unexpected, but totally unavoidable once you read it. And I really got that feeling from the end here, because she kind of stitched throughout this thing about talking about souls, and then grasses and feeding grasses to people, and there was this unexpected humanity in people that you weren't, like the senior was very human in this, or the caged man was, the only kind of glimpse of humanity are these weird tortured people, right?
Yeah.
And then it ends with speaking about memory being worthless, and then it ends with a soft rain one morning at the foot of Maraldina seems like dew that has fallen from I know not what grasses on the summit. And it just takes you back to that imagery of the moon and the softest grasses being on the moon, and that's where the souls go, and the daughter's dead, and like everything is all stitched together with this wonderful poetic line. And it just shows you how much care and time and just how ridiculously dense and well done this is. This is really, really impressive work.
Yeah, totally. It reminded me, Mara, when you were reading that too, it referenced honey. The honey runs throughout this book too. Is one of those, like, honey and bees show up like in every section and sort of morph as they're being used as images or symbols, seemingly throughout the whole thing. But that was another point. Like, I was marking those for a while or circling them. And the same thing with the daughter keeps referring to wanting Black Night. Isn't that what it says? And it comes up a few times too, and it's like such an interesting and strange image of, like, she wants Black Night, which is fairly intense. The line that I was going to say, Brian, you basically stole, was memory is worthless. that's my one for today, which is perfectly apropos, because as I went to call you, Mara, I was like, you know what? I think I forgot to send Mara's brother a book. And I emailed him and was like, I don't know if I did this or not. My memory is garbage. Like, I'm old. Memory is worthless. But anyway.
On that note, no.
But yeah. Do you have a one that you want to add to that too, or is it included in?
This is more a thought than a quote. Okay. And something that I've been surprised that hasn't come up in the discussion about this book that I've been looking at in Catalunya is this. Well, there's this idea of the mouth, right? And they only eat horse and horse fat, and then in this part they're talking about eating grass and of course the cement that they're forced to ingest as they are dying to trap their souls. And to me, there seems to be something there about language and about or even the prisoner, where he's confined and eventually he can only neigh like a horse. Yeah. So that his language, it goes from being human language to horse language in his process of dehumanization, I guess, for lack of a better word. And to me, this has to be related to the situation of Catalan and being a Catalan writer in exile, writing in a language it becomes illegal to publish in and illegal to speak on the streets. And the psychological effect that has on someone.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm surprised no one. That's one of the things I would assume. Like that would be a perfect, like, sort of academic paper or thesis on how language is treated in there, and issue or images of the mouth and of the way that's presented. Because that makes complete sense to me.
Yeah, and almost language as desire and freedom.
Yeah, absolutely, man. The prisoner section too, man. He's it's also intense. So, anyways, well, thank you very much for joining us and talking about this. And for anyone listening, the next episode will be the one that we recorded live at McNally Jackson. So that'll come out next week, and we'll cover the whole book. And then we'll be back with a special bonus episode after that. But anyways, thanks again, Mara, for joining. This was fantastic. It was very informative too, and you added a lot to, like, our knowledge of, like, this book and, like, her life and what's going on with it now in Catalunya.
It's we're hoping that these elections will bring some clarity, and that Catalonia can have a voice and not have cement thrust down its throat.
No more
Let
cement.
Suffering be removed. Let suffering be removed, but not desire, because desire keeps you alive.
Yeah, that's the Senior too, right?
Yeah, it's on 82. I like that one.
That's great. Anyways,
those souls, should they be allowed to be free or not?
Remain trapped in their body.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
just beat some shit, and there'll be some more next year.
Yep. Beat the presents right out of that shit log.
There you go.
God, thank you so much. I'll talk to you guys soon.
Thank you again for coming on, though. I learned so much. It was wonderful having you on with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.